Hello and welcome to a 60-minute session about legal responsibilities for providers working within the educational system. My name is Kelsey Pacha. I am excited to be presenting this material to you today. So for our 60 minutes together, we have 5 learning goals, which are we're going to review 5 California state laws protecting LGBTQ children in the educational system, and also look at one federal law, Title IX, and explore its applications towards all youth based on gender identity, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth. We're going to review at least 3 resources that can help us to advocate for LGBTQ youth in California schools, and identify 2 strategies to advocate for youth. And the strategies are conversation structures, one that we can use with caregivers and one that we can use with colleagues and coworkers that takes more of a psychoeducational approach about the laws that protect youth. A little bit about me before we begin. So I am a trans man. These are 2 images of me in different gender incarnations in my life. I identify as queer, I'm white, I'm highly educated, and I share all of that as well as these images to say that, I've worked with LGBTQ folks and other marginalized communities for 18 plus years. I've worked for about 15 years in the Bay Area supporting LGBTQ youth, done a lot of interfacing with therapists and advocacy on Bay Area school campuses. And so I bring, that personal experience of a trans person, coming through identity and also queer identified, as well as the professional experience, supporting youth and families. I'm a full-time trainer and consultant, so I do policies, procedures, trainings just like this. And I'm also the current board president for Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. We are a national group that puts out a 750-page book called Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, by and for trans and non-binary people. So I'm regularly interfacing with providers, scholars, doctors, clinicians all around the country who are at that cutting edge of, what's best practice to support trans and non-binary folks specifically. So I've done academic writing on the benefits of inclusion, and I'm bringing all of that experience to our session today. And that being said, I want to be clear that, we will be talking about how to implement laws and how to really take ownership of what our legal obligations are in schools to protect LGBTQ students, but I'm not a lawyer. So this is not legal advice. What I am providing is some guidance on, how we can day to day remind people of their legal obligations and make sure that we have a deep understanding of the ownership that we can take and the accountability that we can take in implementing these laws on campus. In my experience, it is professionals who are really clear about what their obligations are and who are practiced in having good conversations where we can really effectively advocate. Despite California having some of the most robust protections for LGBTQ youth in schools, there are many examples where students are prevented from using the bathroom they need to use, or pronouns aren't respected, or harassing statements are not intervened against, right? And so this is really about, using my experience over the years of advocating and supporting LGBTQ youth and their families in schools. What are some effective strategies that we can use? And with that, I want to give us a little bit of context and context specifically about what is going on around the country in terms of some scrutiny leveled against LGBTQ youth. So in 2023 alone, there have been 566 bills introduced in 49 states that restrict the rights of LGBTQ people in some way. 358 are currently active, but over the last 5 years, there's been an increase in laws that provide curriculum restrictions, provide limits on changing identity documents and student records, use of bathrooms, locker rooms, and athletics. And a lot of this comes from myths, misunderstandings, and misinformation about LGBTQ youth and their needs, right, in schools. So we can look at this table and see, just the increasing number of such laws passing around the country. There's really been an explosion, right? But this all started maybe in 2018. And we can look at the different kind of themes, right, of the laws and what they are preventing or impacting in daily life. School restrictions include things like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which is kind of a famous example. And that law does a couple of things. One, it prevents teachers from talking about sexual orientation and gender identity in K through now, I believe, high school. Started with just kindergarten through third grade, and then they've extended the ages. It also implies that teachers have a legal obligation to out students to their parents, which can be quite a dangerous thing, and as we'll see, harmful to the long-term health outcomes of LGBTQ folks. There's also religious exemption laws that allow folks to opt out of abiding by particular laws based on their religious beliefs, and on and on. And the point of me mentioning this, thankfully, again, in California, we've really reiterated, right? The state legislature has reiterated that these protections are important for LGBTQ students. And that doesn't mean that there haven't been lawsuits, right, brought by parents about their parental rights in different districts. Or that there's not just controversy and misunderstanding about what these laws mean and what the purpose is. So I want us to be really clear when we are trying to have effective conversations with caregivers and with our colleagues that we are really grounded in why these laws exist. And when you look at the letter of the law, such as AB 1266, the School Success and Opportunities Act, which we'll review in a little bit, it's actually based on research, and within the law itself, it references the kind of data that provides that it's really important for youth to be able to express their authentic gender identity in schools. So to be very clear, and this is a good talking point, this slide to key in on when we think about our conversation strategy, every major medical and mental health organization in the United States has released statements that state the following. So that there are a range of sexual orientations and gender identities that represent the diversity of human development. So meaning that trans and non-binary youth are not mentally ill. They know who they are. Their identities are real. And that is reinforced by healthcare and mental health disciplines. Secondly, that concrete developmentally appropriate sex education reduces health risk. So when youth have good information that is not abstinence-based, that's not just focused on pregnancy prevention, but talks about the different combinations of bodies, the different kinds of acts, and the health risks that ensue from them, that reduces their risk of STIs, of being in unhealthy or abusive relationships, of HIV and AIDS, right? Furthermore, these organizations state that sexual orientation and gender identity are deeply held identities that might evolve over time, but they can't be changed, right? And in fact, sexual orientation or gender identity change efforts are not only ineffective, but they are unethical, according to these organizations. Finally, specifically when we're thinking about gender transition, the period where a person might go from identifying as one gender to another, these organizations have stated that medical, social, and/or legal transition are often indicated for youth and children who meet certain criteria. And those criteria have to do with the insistence, persistence, and consistency of their stated gender identity, but also the level of distress, right, and risk of self-harm. So even when we're looking at some of these laws that have been passed in places like Florida, Tennessee, et cetera, right, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the APA, and on, have released specific memos and statements condemning these laws because we know that they cause harm. So this is a really important talking point. If we trust the American Medical Association, if we trust the American Academy of Pediatrics, they are basing these statements on research about health and well-being for youth. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what do we know about LGBTQ students' experiences in school broadly. So these tables and information are from a nationwide survey done by GLSEN, their school climate survey, and this data was taken in 2020, I believe, published in 2021. So over half of the LGBTQ students that were surveyed reported hearing homophobic remarks often or frequently in school, and 91.8% of these students were bothered or distressed by these remarks. Right. So anecdotally, this makes a lot of sense, right? If we're constantly in a situation where we are hearing disparaging things about part of our identity, of course, that's going to be distracting, upsetting, right? Impact our relationships and academic performance. 46.6% reported that staff never intervened at school, with only about 14% saying that staff always intervened when remarks that are summarized in this graphic were stated in schools. So anti-LGBTQ comments by peers are very common, and nationwide, we don't have a great track record of adults intervening in those situations. Now, I wanted to show you a little bit of data from Santa Clara County. So you can look up, the annual climate surveys for the state of California by county and see some data from your school districts. Unfortunately, in the past couple of years, the only data that I found that included sexual orientation or gender were from the non-traditional school. So we really only have a little bit of information. I didn't find anything grade 7, 9, 11, but I do think that the disparities that we'll see in these couple of slides are striking. So you can see we're searching Santa Clara under social and emotional health. This is the measure of at any time in the past year, did a student consider suicide? So in non-traditional schools, 4% of the straight or heterosexual identified students had considered suicide, whereas 50%, right? More than 10 times the amount of straight and heterosexual students in a non-traditional setting considered suicide, right? The not straight, LGB, pansexual, queer students. 50% is a really big disparity. We should be concerned about that as providers and educators supporting youth. And we can ask ourselves why, right? As might be, pretty anecdotally clear to you, the impact of hearing anti-LGBTQ comments by peers results in higher levels of depression, lower levels of self-esteem, and some of the strength building factors include having robust anti-discrimination policies, as well as spaces like a gender sexuality alliance or a GSA, where folks can connect on these important issues. Youth who were involved in GSAs in the GLSEN climate survey were less likely to feel unsafe and to experience harassment and victimization. So it does make a difference when we make a concerted effort as educators and staff to provide those spaces to youth. So let's look at what we know from Santa Clara County. What is the prevalence of experiences of harassment? So again, all we have on sexual orientation is from non-traditional schools. Any harassment at school, straight or heterosexual students, 6% experienced any kind of harassment at school, whereas almost 30%, right, almost 5 times more students who identified as not straight, gay, lesbian, or bisexual experienced any kind of harassment at school. So when we look at some of these like socio-emotional factors, we can also look at substance use between straight heterosexual students and not straight students in Santa Clara County. We're still seeing these disparities, right? How many times in the past year did not straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual students get very drunk or high 7 or more times? 40% of them had gotten very drunk or high 7 or more times in the last year, as opposed to only 6% for straight and heterosexual students. So there is a relationship here, right, of coping mechanisms, of experiencing, stress and distress at school. One other thing I want to key us into on the national level is that experiencing victimization and not feeling safe at school results in absenteeism and truancy. So 32, almost 33% of students in the GLSEN School Climate Survey reported missing at least 1 day of school in the last month because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. So there's this mental health impact, but there's also academic performance and absenteeism that is happening. This data is from the Human Rights Campaign Youth Report from 2018. This was a survey of over 10,000 students. And I am using this data because I like the questions that they asked about facility use. So this was all about whether youth were able to use the restrooms and locker rooms that conform to their authentic gender identity, as well as how they were referred to by peers and staff. So in this survey, 51% of the trans youth surveyed said they could never use the restrooms or locker rooms that matched their gender identity. So they were actively prevented from or intimidated in a way that they could not use those spaces. Only 31% felt that they could express their authentic gender identity in school. Only 1 in 3 were always called by their correct name in school. And only 1 in 5 are called by their correct pronouns in schools. Right? And I'll say anecdotally and through some other research on facilities use that youth that don't feel safe using restrooms can have health impacts like kidney infections, bladder infections, UTIs. Again, oftentimes youth, if they need to use the restroom and there's not a safe restroom on their campus, they may leave campus for the rest of the day and not come back. They can get really sick. Like I've seen youth get really sick from being prevented from using the restrooms that they needed to use. So the ability to use bathrooms and feel safe is very, very important to health. Last piece that I want to bring in here, it is becoming more common for younger generations to identify beyond the gender binary, so not as male or female, and to use pronouns other than he or she. So pronouns like they, Z, Zim, Fay, Fair are becoming more common. And when we talk about the School Success and Opportunities Act, educators, providers, staff that work in schools, we have to have some nimbleness around learning new pronouns and using them well, because that is our legal obligation. And if this is something that hasn't come up for you in your practice yet, it will. It absolutely will. 1 in 4 LGBTQ youth, according to a 2020 Trevor Project report, use pronouns or pronoun combinations that fall outside, like the binary construction or the he, she pronouns. And again, when we use correct name and pronouns for young people, it reduces depressive symptoms, it reduces self-harming behaviors and suicidal ideation. So it's about basic respect, it's about our legal obligation, but more so than that, it is about protecting the health and well-being of young people. That is why we must use the correct name and pronoun consistently. One of the critiques or the fears that comes through a lot of these laws and statements about trans and non-binary youth in particular in social and medical transition is the idea that there's not enough longitudinal research to support these interventions for youth. We actually are getting a lot more longitudinal research, especially from the Trans Youth Project out of Princeton, Christina Olson, that's the citation here. This was her group's first publication following cohorts of trans and non-binary youth who are socially and or medically transitioning, and they're following these cohorts of youth, multiple cohorts, over a period of 10 years. In this first publication, they were looking at what is the impact of important adults, teachers, caregivers, etc., that allow young people to express themselves the way they want to in terms of their gender, to wear what they want, to groom how they want, but also to respect their name and pronouns consistently. And what they found is that trans and non-binary youth who were respected in their name and pronouns consistently had no differences compared to a control group of youth who were similar demographically in age and race and so forth, on measures of depression, levels of anxiety, and levels of internal feelings of self-worth. So what this means, right, is when youth have social support and their identities are respected, they don't have any different measures of their mental health or their sense of self, right? A lot of the research we have on the impact of family rejection says that youth who are rejected by caregivers are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. They have higher levels of depression and anxiety. They have lower feelings of self-esteem. They tend to use substances more frequently, and they tend to engage in risky sexual behavior. Just having one supportive adult in an LGBTQ youth's life lowers those health risks across all categories, right? So I hope what one of your takeaways is from this session is that you can be one of those people by knowing how to strategize and effectively advocate within schools, which is where youth spend so much of their time. So let's get into what are some of the laws that protect LGBTQ youth in schools. So we're going to start with at least 5 California state laws. We're going to do it by topic, and then I'll talk about Title IX and how that applies at the end. So in terms of laws regarding curriculum and LGBTQ students, there are 2 of note. The first is called the FAIR Act, which stands for Fair, Accurate, Inclusive, and Respectful Education Act. And what this law does is it added LGBTQ Americans to the California Education Code regarding the groups that need to be included in social studies curriculum, but also in California or US history curriculum. And I believe that's starting in 8th grade, although representing historical figures of all kinds of backgrounds on a variety of protected classes is part of this law as well and starts earlier. And so what this law really does is it says, a teacher can do a unit on the gay rights movement, right? So we can make it a separate module of the material that we're presenting, but we also can just integrate and uplift the figures that are part of our history as we're going through the regular curriculum, right? So thinking about Native folks, right? Native American folks that identify as Two-Spirit and their place in various resistance movements. We could lift up people like James Baldwin or Bayard Rustin, who are gay, who are big features in the civil rights movement of Black and African American folks. There are a ton of free resources and lesson plans at websites like faireducationact.org or lgbtqhistory.org, welcoming schools and communities through HRC that go all the way from kindergarten through college age, and they span subjects. So there's certainly a lot of lesson plans for history, for social studies, for English and literature, but also there are activities for physical education, right? So that's a very good resource if we're supporting educators to integrate the content that LGBTQ folks are part of our history. And every student should learn about the presence of LGBTQ people impacting their lives today. The second important law about curriculum is the California Healthy Youth Act. This law requires that California public schools and any private schools receiving public funding provide comprehensive sex education to students. And this sex education has to be relevant for students based on a variety of sexual orientations, gender identities, races, cultures, etc. So what this really means for LGBTQ students is that in schools where sex education is presented, it cannot just be focused on pregnancy prevention or assume like penis, vagina, sexual intercourse, right? We need to be talking about different combinations of bodies, students that might be on hormones, for example, just because a trans feminine person is on androgen blockers and estrogen progesterone doesn't mean that they can't get someone pregnant, and vice versa. A trans masculine person who's AFAB, assigned female at birth, just because they're taking testosterone doesn't mean that they can't get pregnant, right? And we need to be talking about HIV/AIDS risk, STIs, healthy relationships, and consent. So these 5 bullet points are taken directly from the California Department of Education website that summarizes what the requirements are based on grade level. And that CDE website has a really good frequently asked questions page that details what does California Education Code say needs to be taught before 7th grade and then 7th grade on. Last thing I'll say about this law, I've been in situations where parents have been upset that their students are going to receive this material. And sometimes staff at schools can get really nervous and feel like, oh, we can't possibly present this curriculum, right? Because parents are upset. Very, very important for you to know. And again, it's stated very clearly on the CDE website. Parents can opt their students out. So parents should receive notification, and I think it's within 2 weeks of the days and times where this education is going to be provided. If a parent or guardian wants to take their student out of school, they can do that, but the school must provide this information. Furthermore, there are educators in various counties all around California that are able to travel to schools and provide this information and to facilitate that as a vendor. I used to do that with a partner from a health clinic, and that can also be a really effective way, especially if, we're at a small school, maybe it's a PE teacher who's providing this education and doesn't have a lot of experience. There are lots and lots of resources and folks we can lean on to provide that education. All right, now we want to talk about anti-bullying laws. And the first legal roundtable that we will do, we'll be digging in more depth to these anti-bullying laws we're going to go over. I'm going to start by talking about Seth's Law. So this law is named after a young man who's pictured here, who died by suicide at 12 years old after years of being bullied by classmates. And it was a long-standing dynamic that the parents and the school was aware of. And there was not transparency about what was being done to intervene on his behalf. And so this law did a couple of things. It added the language of actual or perceived characteristics to the non-discrimination statements about bullying, meaning that it doesn't actually matter if a student is gay, is transgender. It doesn't matter what their actual identities are, but if they are being discriminated against and bullied on the basis of their perceived sexual orientation or gender identity expression, they are still protected from bullying, right? And something that I think is very, very important as a take-home for you is that this law is really clear about the responsibilities of anyone who is working on a school campus to intervene directly in the moment, if possible, with any instance of bullying or discrimination. So not only teachers, admin, or folks that are full-time staff of a school, but also, hall monitors, security guards, vendors that might be doing landscaping or maintenance, right? If they witness and are aware of intimidation, harassment, abuse based on any aspect of identity, they're required to intervene when it's safe to do so. Now, this hypothetically means that anytime that staff or a vendor on a school campus hears youth saying that's so gay, right? This law would say you have a legal obligation to intervene immediately and to either discipline that student or do some psychoeducation about why that's not okay, that violates our community agreement. In practice, does this happen? No, of course not. Right? Teachers especially have so many things on their plate, so many requirements they're trying to meet. And so often, not for lack of caring about the issue, these staff might not be able to intervene every single time. So this is a really good example of the difference between kind of the letter of the law and what our legal obligation is versus how it's implemented. So what I think is really important is that a lot of folks that work at schools do not understand, they're not aware of their legal obligation under Seth's Law. And I think when I see success for LGBTQ students feeling involved, connected, safe at schools, it's in schools where there are several staff members, teachers, therapists, who really take on the mantle of, I am a person who intervenes every time. Right? Because when there is a teacher or a staff member who lets it go, students pick up on that, right? And they will elevate harassment and intimidation in those contexts. So it's very important for us to take ownership and to be consistent in the ways that we are intervening based on our legal obligation under this law. Second important law related to anti-bullying is AB 537, the Student Safety and Violence Protection Act. What this law does is it provides clear procedures for how schools are supposed to respond to any complaints of discrimination or bullying, and what recourse students and families have if they are not satisfied with how a school is responding to a discrimination complaint. So in my experience, unfortunately, discrimination complaints of all kinds can really fall through the cracks if folks are not attending to their legal obligations. So schools have to identify procedures and staff to respond to discrimination complaints, and that's true under Title IX as well. So as we'll talk about, your district or your school should have a Title IX coordinator, and their contact information should be readily available on a website or in a directory. But furthermore, if discrimination complaints are brought to a school, the school has to respond within 60 days to that student and family, and they have to respond in writing. And responding in writing is really, really important because there have been situations where, let's say there's a teacher who actively refuses to call a student by their correct pronouns. This is coming from a real life example. And, student and parents complain, and, the principal says something like, "We're taking care of it," right? So there's no email, there's no written communication about the follow through. And it's a very vague sort of like, "We're aware of this and we're going to take care of it." Well, if the behavior continues, there's really no way for the students or the parents to be assured that the school has disciplined the teacher, provided professional development, whatever is needed to get them compliant with the law. So schools have to respond within 60 days in writing. And if they don't, the complainants, meaning the student and their guardians, have the right to report that to the California Department of Education. So in one of the handouts that you should get with this training, helpful links regarding legal responsibilities for providers in schools, there's a link directly to the CDE website where you can make a report to the state. And the state then has 60 days to respond in writing. So you can report to the state if a school doesn't respond within that 60 days. You also can appeal to the state if a complainant doesn't feel satisfied with the school's decision or how they're moving forward after a discrimination allegation. All right. Now we're going to talk about some laws relating to facilities, athletics, and student records. So I've mentioned this law, AB 1266, the School Success and Opportunities Act, a couple of times. This law is very, very important and has implications that are pretty far-reaching in schools. So what this law does overall is it provides that students need to be respected with their correct name and pronoun, regardless of what is on their legal records. So schools do need to keep legal records with students' legal name and gender information on things like transcripts, and in general to report to the government, right? And in California, even if a student doesn't change their name or gender, they need to be called by their correct name and gender pronoun, even if that's not on their student record. This law also provides that students get to participate in sex-segregated activities like sports, sometimes like Boys, Girl Scouts, other clubs, based on their gender identity, not based on their legal gender. And finally, this law provides that students are able to use the restrooms, locker rooms, and changing facilities that conform to their authentic gender identity. When this law was passed, I believe it was passed in 2012 and became implemented in 2013, there was a lot of fear from parents and other adults, specifically about girls and women being harassed by boys masquerading as girls in the restroom or locker rooms. And as someone who is socialized female, right, grew up as a young girl, was sexually objectified from a young age, had boys and men say and do inappropriate things, I understand why adults would be concerned about girls specifically being in a vulnerable state where they are undressing. Something that I like to remind people of is that Los Angeles Unified School District, which is a huge school district, had this same policy as a district-wide policy for 10 years before it was passed statewide. So starting in maybe 2002, 2003. And within that time, there were 0 instances. It never happened that a student masqueraded as a trans student, as a gender they didn't identify with, in order to harass or intimidate other kids in the restroom or locker room. In my experience, that is far less likely than gender nonconforming students being told you can't use this restroom, I'm not comfortable with you using this restroom, told to use another restroom, or told they're in the wrong restroom, right? But furthermore, I like to remind folks, what recourse do we have if harassment or intimidation happens in the locker room or restroom? Well, Title IX prevents sexual harassment, right? But furthermore, there should be school policies that say, regardless of why it happens or the context that it happens within, harassment or intimidation in the restroom is never okay. Right? So we always have disciplinary options and recourse if any kind of harassment or intimidation occurs in restrooms or locker rooms. Another note about facilities, the Equal Restroom Access Act provides that all single occupancy restrooms, so meaning a locked door that has a toilet, maybe toilet and urinal, automatically has to be all gender or gender neutral in the state of California. So whether we're talking about restaurants, corporate offices, parks, or schools, any single stall restroom is able to be used by people of all genders. Something that I've seen happen a lot on school campuses is that if there is only one single stall locking restroom, often trans and non-binary students will be told that that's the only restroom that they can use, which is illegal. Trans and non-binary students can use any multi-stall restroom or single-stall locking restroom that is comfortable for them and conforms to their gender identity. No student, no parent, no staff member can prevent someone from using the restroom that conforms to their authentic gender identity. Again, if we suspect that someone is not being honest about their gender identity or has another purpose in using a restroom or a locker room, we do have recourse by preventing, intimidation or bullying. Sometimes we need to be creative about how we create spaces, especially locker room or changing room spaces that are comfortable for students of all genders. Especially for trans and non-binary students that might not be comfortable in a boys' locker room or a girls' locker room, we can have some creativity about how we create those spaces. So we can do things like use curtains, or just use a bathroom that's near a gym if folks are changing for a sport or for physical education. And you can have the private changing areas in boys and girls locker rooms for any student's use. So there are also really compelling reasons why this can be important for cisgender students, right, who want privacy for whatever reason. We can use curtains, we can use nearby restrooms. If anyone is uncomfortable with this, meaning they're uncomfortable with their child changing with trans and non-binary students, that child can change separately too, right? But again, we need to prioritize the trans and non-binary students' comfort here and acknowledge that gender diversity is real and prevalent, and there need to be spaces for folks to change. We can go over a conversation structure where we can psychoeducate parents about this. Truly, in my experience, and the data would back this up as well, there really aren't safety concerns for cisgender students based on using restrooms and locker rooms with trans and non-binary folks. Most of us have done that without knowing it, in fact. But there are serious safety concerns for trans and non-binary students in those vulnerable spaces, right? Youth do not have to provide any documentation to prove that they're eligible to use a given space. And again, we can always fall back on harassment of any kind in these spaces isn't legal. This is just more information that I've already kind of gone over verbally about this being an LA unified policy before it was statewide. Also that there is research data showing health impacts, UTIs, bladder infections, etc., from youth being prevented from using the correct restroom. So again, this is the kind of information we want to put a pin in that we would use in the conversation structures we'll go through in just a moment. I also just want you to know that this is something that is being talked about on the federal stage. So California has this state law that's really clear about restroom and locker room access. This has been brought to the Supreme Court, which basically didn't take the case, and so it rested on appeal that happened, saying that Title IX protects youth in using the locker rooms and restrooms that conform to their authentic gender identity. This is going to continue to be resolved in case law across the country. This only provides this protection in a couple of different federal circuits, but it doesn't matter in California because AB 1266 protects children in this way. So AB 1266 is also really relevant for student record changes because students don't have to provide documentation that they have legally changed their name or gender in order to receive the services that they want. And they need to be protected. Let's say substitute teachers coming through and making sure that on a class roster, we aren't using the legal name and legal gender for students that go by a different name or gender. So again, I would send you to the California Department of Education website on AB 1266. They have a great frequently asked question page that talks very specifically about how the state interprets this law and a student's right to privacy. So this is just an excerpt from that website. Again, this is linked in your handout called Helpful Links. So this says a transgender or gender nonconforming student may not express their gender identity openly in all contexts, including at home, right? Including with their guardians. Revealing a student's gender identity or expression to others, including parents, may compromise the student's safety. Thus, preserving a student's privacy is of the utmost importance. The right of transgender students to keep their transgender status private is grounded in California's anti-discrimination laws as well as federal and state laws. So on the website, they list parts of the Ed Code, FERPA, as well as the California Constitution that the state interprets as being relevant for protection of trans students' gender identities in California. Disclosing that a student is transgender without the student's permission may violate California's anti-discrimination laws by increasing the student's vulnerability to harassment and may violate the student's right to privacy. So I think questions 5, 6, and 7 talk about student privacy. It's really important to state that this is regardless of age, right? So a 6-year-old student who says, I want to go by this name and pronoun, a teacher, a therapist, any other staff is not obligated. And in fact, based on what I see on the CDE website, is prevented from disclosing that information to a parent. Only in rare situations where it's directly related to self-harm or risk of harm to self or others, can that be disclosed. But on that frequently asked question page, the CDE is pretty conservative with what situations really require disclosing that a student is going by a different name or pronoun at school. I know that this is really controversial, and it's very important to recognize, as the CDE references in that statement, that this is based on the data we have about impacts on health, right? That students should be allowed to go by the name and pronouns that conform to their gender identity. And especially in spaces where their guardians might not be supportive, it's really important to their health that they have that protection at school. Another thing to think about, a lot of schools have student databases that are online where guardians can access student records. And so if a student requests that their name and gender pronoun be changed, we may need to get kind of creative and be transparent with them about what kind of privacy they do have. In some situations, parents might be automatically notified of any changes to their student records, maybe when they get grades once a quarter or once a semester. And it's really important to recognize that, a lot of admin folks and secretaries or IT people that manage these databases aren't aware that you can create new fields. So almost always these databases are customizable. So if there's not currently a place where we can put correct name, right? And that's the name that auto-populates on student rosters and other records that the public would see. We can ask the person who manages that database to create a new field. That's not relevant just for trans and non-binary students, but also students that have westernized names, right? They're not going by a cultural name. They've been known as Johnny, right? So everyone knows them as that name and not this other name. Furthermore, we can create custom fields for pronouns that can auto-populate, again, on rosters and things like that. Very important to recognize, a transcript is a legal document. It has to have legal name on it. A diploma is not a legal document. It's a nice piece of paper that can say literally anything the student wants it to say. Diplomas are very important documents that we take a lot of pride in when people graduate, right? There is absolutely no reason why a school cannot or should not have someone's correct name on their diploma. So, possible steps to change student records. We need to identify who the right person is. Sometimes it's someone who works at the school full-time. Sometimes it's a contractor that needs to do that. But again, students of all ages have the right to request that change and have the school honor it without notifying their parents. We want to know if there's any kind of system automatically that will notify parents or guardians. We want to know how this is communicated to teachers, so we don't have students outed, in science class, but they're using another name in reading class, something like that. Again, it's important as a provider that we explain to the student what are the ways they may potentially be outed and do safety planning, especially if they are at risk for being kicked out of their home, being rejected, or abused in some way because of this disclosure. In terms of changing the records, the CDE talks about various strategies to separate and store legal information from the accurate information to refer to the student, and to figure out what auto-populates, especially for roll call. Because again, when we think about having substitute teachers coming in, we don't want someone to be suddenly outed. I want to remind folks that in California, we have a non-binary legal gender designation. So you may also work with youth who have a non-binary designation or an X designation on their legal documents. So that also needs to be respected and kept private. So someone might have that on their birth certificate, on their driver's license. And, the places where I see this coming up where we need to be careful is, let's say there's an international trip that the school is planning and we're looking at passports and things like that. We really want to be thinking about how can we keep students safe when we're going abroad. And sometimes we might need to strategically have, okay, I have an F on my passport, but my California driver's license has an X designation, right? Maybe there's something about my gender presentation that would make it safer for me to do that. The Biden administration has interpreted Title IX to protect LGBTQ youth. So even though the letter of Title IX prevents sex discrimination, sex is being interpreted to include gender identity, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth, as well as many cases, including sexual orientation. So again, any school that gets government funding has to designate a Title IX coordinator. This person is responsible for taking complaints and for implementing Title IX on campus. Best practice is to have that person's name, email, contact information publicly available on a website, in brochures, in information that we give parents and students. Oftentimes they're in equity, sometimes health and wellness, sometimes they're teachers or even the superintendents, depending on how large our school or district is. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about students' right to privacy and to consent to certain kinds of care. Most important thing here is that under laws like AB 2119, which is called Gender Health and Foster Care, and then restated in other consent laws and family and ed code, youth who are 12 years of age and older in California have the right to privately consent on their own without guardian permission to gender-affirming mental health care in California. Right? So what this means is that Actually, let's go here and then I'll come back. What this means is that as long as this 12-year-old and older youth is mature enough to participate intelligently in treatment, so that's directly from the law, they can consent to outpatient mental health counseling, which includes gender-affirming care. So what this means is that if you are a therapist working in a school and you're doing any kind of work around gender exploration, gender identity, the youth has the right to get that support, and we cannot share that the youth is exploring their gender with their guardians. Again, unless we're in a situation where it's related to mandatory reporting requirements, but it's best to be conservative about that. In what situations truly is a risk to self or others related to gender identity, right? And we need to take into account how that would impact the young person. So providers can only share records with student permission if they're 12 years of age and older. Oftentimes, this might be covered by Medi-Cal, or the student might need to pay privately. Either way, even if there is payment or insurance through the parents do not have the right to know exactly what is talked about in those sessions unless the student has given permission or there is a compelling mandatory reporting requirement at play. Minors can also consent to a limited number of medical healthcare decisions. So things like pregnancy prevention, contraception, HPV vaccine, PrEP, and PEP, so pre and post-exposure HIV prophylactics. Adolescents 12 and older can receive treatments for STIs and also preventative measures. Some other examples of medical treatments that 12-year-old and older students can consent to are listed here. You may be in a situation where a student needs to leave school campus to attend a medical appointment of this type, which again, we wouldn't be able to reveal where the appointment is or what kind of medical care is being provided. And I have resources on that helpful links handout for further review. Relevant for our purposes for LGBTQ youth, really, I think just knowing that youth 12 years of age and older can consent to gender-affirming mental health treatment is very important, right? Youth have the right to gender-affirming mental health care in California. Some of the premises of gender-affirming care, this is really about seeing that gender variations aren't disorders. So we don't have to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, for example, in order for a young person as an adult or as a minor with guardian consent to get gender affirming medical care treatment, right? To have medical transition interventions. Recognizing that gender is diverse and varied across cultures, that it's biopsychosocial, it's not always binary but fluid, that dysphoria is not always just about the body, it can be social as well, and that acceptance by important adults significantly improves mental health. Those are some of the premises of gender affirming care. And really, gender affirming care is about not pathologizing when folks are trans or non-binary, but seeing that as a unique part of human diversity and walking alongside with students as they're exploring their gender with unconditional positive regard and appropriate resources. Lastly, just want to talk about some best practices and give you some resources related to implementing these laws. When we're thinking about discrimination complaints, anti-bullying, if we are supporting a student who's experiencing harassment or bullying, documentation is so important. Having a paper trail can make the difference in complaint cases. So the 6 W's, I really like this as a mnemonic. Who was involved, what happened, where it happened, when it happened, who it was reported to, whether it was reported at all, whether they did something and when, and if there were any witnesses. So even if we are working with a student, let's say, who is consistently bullied by another student, or another teacher for that matter, that student might say, I actually don't want to do something about it right now. I just want you to know that it's bothering me and it's really hard. We can still take notes and say, okay, on September 8th, 3 p.m., student reported XYZ happened, mentioned that this friend was present, and take down this information. When incidences escalate and we don't have dates, times, we didn't take any notes about when we first heard about incidents, it's a lot harder to appropriately support the student and also to appropriately educate and support the person who is targeting that student. So the more of a paper trail we can have, even if it's kind of anonymized, so important to keep track of that information. Lastly, I want to give you a couple of conversation structures that I think are just helpful to organize our thoughts and how we might advocate with either caregivers or with colleagues. So starting with caregivers, there are good reasons and valid reasons why parents might be uncomfortable, especially around some of the privacy and consent laws that exist in California. They exist for good reason, but I certainly don't blame parents for feeling nervous of like, oh gosh, is my student, is my child going to medical appointments I don't know about? Are they engaging in sexual activity and I can't know about it? Are they questioning their gender and I don't know? So if we are supporting those parents or caregivers, here is a 4-step process that you can make your own. Number one, really important to figure out what is the fear or concern. Sometimes caregivers are upset and they don't really know why unless someone listens to them and reflects back what they're hearing, right? So we can ask specific questions. We can kind of reflect back, gosh, I'm kind of hearing that you're afraid that, if your child explores their gender, they're going to transition and they're going to make these irreversible changes without you knowing. That sounds really scary. I can understand why you would be scared of that, right? But also, let's address that, right? Let's talk about what's the reality here? Second step, validating and reassuring. A lot of caregivers do have trouble when they have a vision for their child and who they are, and then that is changed or questioned, right? And coming out as queer, coming out as trans, non-binary can certainly challenge the parent's vision for their child. So saying something like, a lot of parents feel confused, scared, or even angry when their child comes out. I know you care about your child. I'm here to partner with you to make sure they're safe and healthy, right? Number 3, addressing the fear, very important. I want you to take some of the research we've gone over today to psychoeducate the parents, right? So for example, let's say the parent is, afraid that their child is going to transition, make permanent changes and regret it. Number 1, let's review what are the conversations that you've had with your child and kind of what are they telling you? Are we in reality about where your child is at, or is this just a projection of a fear? But furthermore, we do have research about transition regret. So how about I prepare a little bit of that information for you and we can talk about it together, and that might help to allay some of your fears. Number 4, make a plan. So depending on our positionality, can we support the parent or do we need to refer them? Are we doing family therapy? How can we get them more information and support from other parents, from other providers? But furthermore, we really need to be prioritizing the safety of the child. So how can we do that in line with our legal obligations in schools? This 4-step conversation is for advocacy with colleagues or with folks that we're working at in school-based contexts. This is a really similar conversation structure, except the number 3 point, this is a little less emotional. This is more about, we need to talk about our legal obligations. So number 1, we're identifying the problem. Let's say, I've heard several teachers at the school aren't respecting the student's pronouns. Number 2, always good to ask for more information. So if this is being reported by a couple of students, maybe we're not getting the full story, right, of what's going on. So getting more information, especially from our colleagues, is helpful because we can hear their perspective and maybe get information that we didn't have before. Then number 3, we want to bring in those supportive laws or policies. So saying something like, in this case, a lot of providers don't know this, but under AB 1266, the School Success and Opportunities Act, every employee on a public school campus must respect a student's gender pronouns without requiring any documentation. It's different if someone is making a mistake and they're trying to correct it. But if someone outwardly says, I will not call you by this pronoun, a formal complaint can be filed. Folks have been fired and disciplined for that behavior. And really, there are so many ways we can practice together, lots of resources that we can use to become more familiar with gender pronouns. And then we want to make a plan. And I think trying to approach it as a partnership of like, hey, I have a little bit of experience with this. I know it can be hard to change the pronouns that we use. Do you want to spend like 10 minutes a week just kind of practicing using these pronouns in a sentence? Here's this great game that I found online that helps you to practice pronouns or worksheets. Do we know of any consultants, professional development that this person needs that could help them be a little bit more nimble in this situation? So lastly, I'm going to give you some resources and then we will wrap up. A really great resource, especially for trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming students, is from Gender Spectrum, the Gender Support Plan. This is created for schools and it is made to be very clear with, what is the student's legal information? Who are they using given name and pronouns with, whether it's colleagues, teachers, peers? What do guardians know? What will we call them when we are doing parent-teacher conferences? And what are the students' wishes, right? So it's very, very specific about how is the student's privacy being held? How are they being referred to in schools versus maybe with guardians? It's just a really good way to organize that information. They also have something called a gender communication plan, which is where someone is communicating a change in status. So maybe this is the moment where a student wants to change their record, or a student is changing their record and they're coming out to caregivers, and we are someone supporting them in that effort in schools. So a gender communication plan is a little bit different, and it's more focused on how would we communicate a change in this person's gender. Couple of great resources, especially for clinicians, about what gender affirming care is. The Gender Creative Child is a really good book that can help caregivers and providers understand sort of the world of gender for the new generation. What does it mean if a 7-year-old says, I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl? Sometimes I feel like a boy, sometimes I feel like a girl, and gives a lot of case examples and best practices for both parents and providers to support youth as they explore their gender. These are just some examples of activities and picture books that we can use with young kids to explore gender and sexuality, different kinds of pronouns. It's a good idea to have books like this in your school that reflect the lived realities of students that we're working with. And again, recognize that a variety of sexualities and gender identities are part of human diversity. In terms of resources for families and caregivers, Somos Familia is a great organization that pairs parents together from different cultural backgrounds. Started as peer-to-peer Spanish-speaking parents that have children coming out supporting one another, but now they have folks that speak Tagalog, Mandarin, right? But are coming from similar cultural perspectives, since so many LGBTQ resources assume English language and also are often really white, right? Gender Spectrum has online groups for caregivers, siblings, and youth who are coming out from a variety of backgrounds. And they also just have a lot of really good school-based resources if you need them. Within Santa Clara County, Q Corner has a lot of different kinds of resources within behavioral health, different resources and referrals that can be made, peer support, mentoring, social activities. So there's some contact information here. And then the Trans Care Coalition of Santa Clara County, this is a screenshot from their website. You can get all kinds of information about practice with pronouns, good practices for collecting data on clients that are gender and sexuality inclusive, a review of some of the laws we've talked about today, and direct links to Santa Clara County policies about restroom use, right? About some of the laws that we've talked about. A couple of legal resources. If I were going to recommend one to you, let's say you're having trouble advocating for a student, or a given school is not responding to a serious concern, I would call the National Center for Lesbian Rights, this hotline right here. They've always gotten back to me within 48 hours. They can't give direct legal advice, but they can summarize laws, and they can also give referrals to attorneys or to organizations that can be helpful and supportive. I gave some links for how to file complaints against different kinds of providers, against teachers, if that is, or school administration, if that is relevant for you. Included some LGBTQ youth hotlines and helplines that can be helpful for youth to get peer support, or if they are in crisis outside of the school day. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today. I hope that this was helpful for your practice. I am going to be leading 4 legal roundtables, 2 dates in October, 2 dates in November, where we'll spend an hour. It can be a full Q&A session. I'll have a few slides based on each topic of the different laws that protect LGBTQ students in schools. They're all from 3 to 4 p.m. They're all on, I believe, Tuesdays. October 17th, we'll be talking about anti-bullying laws and how to implement those. The 24th, we'll talk about bathrooms and locker rooms. On the 7th, we'll talk about name and gender changes on student records. And on the 14th, we'll talk about minor consent and privacy laws. And I'll be sending a lot more resources and looking at some of the state policies directly so we can be very clear on implementing these laws. Again, thanks for your time. I look forward to seeing you in October, November.